you would think about the viewing of cut piece and just kind of, formulate questions, comments, concerns, ideas. So I'll just kind of open it up to that before we move forward. Any more thoughts on this work by Yoko Ono?
The more I thought about it, the more I got a little more agitated.
Mm-hmm. And what?
It made me mad because he would just cut.
Mm-hmm.
Here's your for everybody to see.
Yeah, the guy at the end of the documentation.
And you could tell that she was uncomfortable by it. She started to at first be like, "Hey, stop!" or cover herself. But then she's like, "I can't do this because that would not. That's not part of what this is."
Yeah, and it has to do with the way that he does it. I forgot who asked, it might have been you, Carly, who asked the question as to whether specific instructions was it you? Whether specific instructions were given, and they were. I mean, she basically said that that the audience was invited to remove remove any piece of her clothing or something like that using the scissors. So that idea was put forward, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you had to per se. Yeah,
well,
or how you did it.
Because we studied this in Karen's performance class.
Yeah,
it's interesting how you see the differences in people as compared to what articles of clothing they removed and how much they removed.
Mm-hmm.
You can see if they are uncomfortable doing it or if they just don't care. It's interesting to see that interaction.
Yeah, so in a lot of ways, or in some ways, it's less about Yoko Ono and more about the people who choose to engage with her, in this project, and I think that's interesting too. And there's a kind of sociological aspects to it. Did you, when you saw it in the performance class, did you talk about it in any particular way? Was there anything that you want to bring to our discussion, based on what you learned from that?
Talking about it. I don't remember what we talked about.
Oh, that's okay. I just know if there's anything that's stuck in your mind that's being important, but obviously that either way, yeah. All right, good. Amy first, and then good.
I just think it's interesting how people some people were like, "Oh, this is a woman, this is a person. Let's not make her encourage hands on her."
Mm-hmm.
And other people were like, "Oh, this is a performance. Let's do the most drastic thing we can to it."
Yeah, because Amoge talks about he's treating it as if he's the artist in a way. I mean, you get since he's got a big ego. He's kind of playing with the scissors. It's kind of a sort of a kind of theatrical flair, in a way. Yeah. Oh, Mike, Mike gets it.
It's more of a. I don't want to get hit with the slings and arrows here. I don't condone what the guy did, but I think about the time period and think about the people that maybe knew exactly who she was, and think about the people that held animosity towards her to what she did to the Beatles, and how she, interrupted everything. Even though
when does that happen though? Because I know that's later though.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
But isn't she part of John's life already?
Oh yeah, at this point, I'm not sure. It depends on. Oh, I don't have the previous images because he meets her at the time of the Yes piece. The ladder. It's whatever the date of that. Does anyone have the date of that? 66. Yeah, I was thinking that's a little bit later.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is kind of right
about the same time.
Yeah, this is kind of right
that's
on
the
the
only
edge.
thing that would be another reason.
And then when did
that
the
guy
Beatles break up in 70?
Oh yeah.
Did I say? Yeah, right. Okay. Isn't that crazy that we know these things? Yeah, I know pop culture is important, and especially in this time frame. And we're gonna when we're done talking about Fluxus, we're gonna start talking about pop art. And part of the reasons why I kind of wanted to talk about abstract expressionism and Europeans and Fluxus, because it really is international in sort of its scope. And then pop art, because pop art really deals with media and really folds in media. Fluxus, not so much. So we kind of stay away from that track when we get to pop art. And we're going to things are going to churn in that respect. Kelly, did you put your hand up?
Yeah, I'm like Mike. I'm not saying that the guy should have done what he did, but I kind of feel like it went as far as Yoko had expected it to go. Because, she wanted to say something about this piece, and if it didn't get to the point where it's exposing some sort of vulnerability, then, to me it would have been as successful or as interesting
Yeah, I mean there is that tension, right? And this is true for a lot of performance artists, is they put themselves in vulnerable positions, or especially if you're doing a performative piece that is so open ended that you invite people to do something and you let it play out. You have no idea necessarily how that's going to play out. Yeah.
And I mean, it's true that like, what else was she expecting? Because people are going to take as far as they can because people are just mean. But also, it's not necessarily just the fact that he did that, but more in like you were saying, in his like, you can kind of tell like his ego and like the dramatic flair that he did it. Like, kind of very like dominating and just kind of like.
Yeah, and you watch the guy and you think, ooh, and you feel like, it's like, red flag, how that guy. The other thing, too, I think that's important to consider is that it's also being, the performance is presented as art. It's in a theatrical kind of space or a performative space. And I think, in a sense, that's a pretty protected space at the same time. I think, even though if you were to imagine, sitting passively on the stage with a pair of scissors and people cutting your clothes off, that's, certainly an intense situation. But I think, even among everybody who's present, there's this idea that this is art, and that it's, that they're, all, working together. And so I think there is a certain level of protection. But you do see hear the audience become really uncomfortable with that guy, and it goes from being something kind of fun where people are laughing and maybe some of that's nervous laughter, but they start, but they don't say boo so much, but you're going ooh, which is a pretty intense thing. And all of a sudden you realize that the dynamic has shifted, and that there's this, and we can talk about the work in some ways in terms of, from a social aspect. I'm not sure what the right descriptive word is. But it's the social dynamics. People come together. One person does something, it makes another person feel comfortable. It kind of allows the flow of things, and then all of a sudden it gets reined in. To a certain point, like you went too far. Yes, Samantha, you got your
It just another piece that we've looked at. This reminds me of is Marina Abramović.
Yes.
And her just sitting there very passively at a table, and she lets the viewers come up and sit across from her and do whatever they want to do.
Mm-hmm.
And she just sits there, with this blank expression. And, it's very powerful, especially at the end when apparently somebody who was important in her life came up and, they both break down in tears.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's from like 2002.
Do you remind me of the different pieces?
I was that's right. Yeah.
She had like an arrangement of several pieces.
Yeah, that's the one I was
the one with the gun
too.
and like somebody comes up and points it at her.
Yeah, it was like a whole bunch of different objects, some that could be pleasurable, some that could be painful, one of them being a gun and a bullet, and the person picks up the gun, puts the bullet in the gun, and holds it to
That's
the
what
gun.
I thought of.
Yeah, and people stopped it. Like the people who were there were like, no, this, they made that decision. And that's some years later after this, but yeah, I think there's definitely some connections. One of the things about the piece too is that when she does this in 1965, I think it's also important to consider it within the context of the time. Two things that are really significant to her are, that the Vietnam War is really raging at this point. So it's important to understand about Yoko Ono too, is that she was a child during World War II. So she was born and raised in Japan. She lived in a country that was at war. She lived in a country that was bombed with atomic weapons. And really, when you look at her larger, life and body of work, she's really strongly oriented toward the peace movement and trying to, stop war, prevent war in those respects. So this idea of passivity, of passive, active, doing violence, because the thing is, what could have happened here is nobody, no one could have chosen to participate. That was one possibility that didn't actually occur. And also too, with her being an Asian woman, even though she's Japanese, and especially the dynamic, and this took place in New York City, the dynamic in the U.S. was often that Americans, don't differentiate from one Asian person to another. And in our history, there have been, numerous events where individuals were angry at one particular, Asian country, and attacked people who just looked Asian, as opposed to a Japanese person versus a Vietnamese person and so on. So that's supposed to be within the time period that's kind of running in the background. And then the other thing is that she's developing a feminist kind of outlook at this period of time. And a couple of years after this piece was done, I think it's like 69, well maybe more, 60 under 70, she writes really eloquently about that as well. So the idea that she's presenting herself, and not that she can present herself in any other way, but being Asian and being a woman on top of it, also, all of these things are there and certainly present. And part of the reason I mentioned this too is because in more recent years, the other thing that comes into play is age as well. And she, in 2003, she re-performed Cut Piece, and it was a very different, thing in many ways, and she talks about that experience too. Part of it has to do with the understanding that, the piece has been done before, so there's a certain kind of expectation. But certainly the dynamics are different. And I'm not going to talk too much about it because I do want to show you. We're going to look at, I'm just going to move forward here, a few video snippets in which she'll talk about this experience. I want to kind of leave you with this idea, and we'll come back to it. The other thing too is that I'd also mentioned that, especially through the course of her career, she's done a lot of different kinds of work. Some of it, and it overlaps with the environment as well in a number of ways. But she's really, the theme that's kind of really running through her work is the peace movement. She began, and she also has worked on these projects over extended periods of time, which I think is interesting too. She did a project that began in 1996 called the Wish Tree, and it's based on a Japanese cultural sort of tradition of literally of hanging at Buddhist temples, of hanging prayers, of writing a prayer or something that you would desire to happen, somebody to get through an illness or something like that, onto trees, outside of the temple. So what she did in various places all over the world with her goal of basically assembling not 1,000, but 1 million of these wishes was to place them, and usually through museums, but to place these living trees in various places and offering people the opportunity to write a wish and hang it on the tree. This is her note here, and it's important that it's handwritten. These are placed near the tree, so it's very personal in that sense. So this is the wish tree for MoMA, and she says, make a wish, write it down on a piece of paper, fold it and tie it around a branch of the wish tree. Ask your friend to do the same. Keep wishing. So this is so the project began in 1996. The one for MoMA was just a few thousand years ago. Jesus, a few years ago in 2010. There we go. I'll get my words in the right order. The idea behind this project was that all of the wishes would be collected. So 1 million, wishes, ideally towards goodwill, would then be basically sort of interred or buried within this monument. I mean, monument's probably the best word for it. This monument here, which is called the Imagine Peace Tower. So if you think about it, and then going back to John Lennon, one of his best known songs is Imagine, and that sort of catchphrase in a way that's associated with Lennon. In 2007, she completed this project. It's in Reykjavik, Iceland, for a number of reasons. You'd wonder why, of all places in the world, why here? And as we talk about it, it'll begin to make sense. It's essentially there's this kind of central core that you see here. All of the wishes are buried, within this. I think I've got another view of it here in a moment, but. On the outside of the structure is the word peace in 27 different languages, so you can kind of walk around it in a circle. And the way it's constructed, so this is a view of it, it functions a few years, or at least this part of it, but you certainly can go visit it at any time. And there's one of the Imagine Peace in English that you see here. And then it basically uses concentrated light and mirrors to project this beam of light, basically up into the heavens. It's apparently, I think it's visible from space, supposedly, and I forget the exact, distance that it projects upwards. And part of the reason why it's in Reykjavik is that in Iceland, in this particular part of Iceland, they use geothermal energy. So basically what they're doing is, because there's a lot of geologic activity, is they're using naturally occurring heat and hot water to power turbines. So it's renewable, it's green energy or renewable energy. The way this functions is the light that you see, there's this beam of light, kind of the idea is it's almost as if all of these wishes are literally being beamed, out into the universe. It functions from, or the light functions from October, it's through either December or January, and that represents Lennon's birthday was in October, and then he was shot and killed in December or January. So it just, the light part of it just functions within those years. So she wanted to make this memorial, but was also being really sensitive to the materials that were being used, to the energy, that would be used, so it doesn't run all the time, and it's run using using energy from renewable resources. So that I think is really specific. And this idea of, it's funny because we think of it if you think of the 60s, the idea of peace and love, we can almost think of it as really kind of cheesy concepts today, but she's taken this idea of peace and love and just continuing to use it up into our own time. Yeah, question.
So since the wish tree was done at the moment in 2010, what are some of those wishes?
Oh, what are some of the wishes?
Well, this was done in 2007, so that was before.
Yeah, it continues. I think they've continued to be added to the site. I think your goal was to reach 1 million, and my understanding is that it has been reached. But I think it's a thing where this part of it is complete, but it's an ongoing project. Yeah, and this has been going on for a while. There's another project that's also an ongoing project called the Smiles Project, and we're gonna watch 2 short videos. This one's really pretty short, and this was from an interview in 1971. And it's interesting too, and I think it's also worth considering. But here, she's a pretty relatively young artist. She's articulating ideas about her project, but maybe not as effectively as she could. And then we'll watch another little bit longer video, which was produced more recently, and she talks about this project and really about finally being able to realize this project because of the technology that was involved. So, and I think that's interesting too, where she's developing this idea around 1970, but can't really do it because she could, but it wasn't really feasible in that time frame. But as we get closer and into our own time, it becomes possible. So anyway, I'll let her explain that. But you also see her mature as an individual, and I think certainly as an artist as well. Oh no, did it not link? I didn't double check this before class, but it looks like. Let me see if I can find these in YouTube fast, because that's probably where they're located.
I was going to ask everybody to take a snapshot of a smiling face of him or herself, and they would just sort of send it to maybe the local post office or something. And the government would have a sort of whole pile of snapshots of smiling faces. And then we would have an arrangement with the TV so that when somebody wants to see something, like say if Nixon decides that he wants to see what sort of Vietnam people he killed that day, instead of say 2,000 Vietnamese so-and-so place, say what sort of 2,000 Vietnamese would just sort of looking at the TV, turn the channel on and you see these smiling faces. So after this film, you become a smiling face instead of part of a figure, like on a newspaper, every day on a headline it says 2,000 people killed, 150 burned, and we are sort of used to thinking people in terms of figures. But if we had a sort of file of people's smiling faces, then that means that everybody will have a chance when they're born. They know that just once in their life they might be able to communicate with the whole world.
Right, so keep in mind this is certainly pre-internet. And I think also too, this work you can see where it's also very political as well. So what she's trying to do is humanize, I don't know what way of thinking about it, maybe humanizing humanity. I don't know if that's, oops.
Mrs. John Lennon. John Lennon.
Nope, we're not going to watch that part. So to humanize people, right? Because especially, and it's connected to her anti-war efforts, but within the larger context, it's toward the peace movement. Let's see if I can find this one too.
Next, from one of the most famous actors on the planet to a woman once described by John Lennon as the world's most famous unknown artist. Now, with a new exhibition showcasing 5 decades of her work, we can all get to know the artist that is Yoko Ono a little bit better.
In the last few years, DJs have started crushing out remixed tracks like this one. And a generation of topless men and bikini party girls punch their arms in the air.
But I wonder if any of them would have recognised that correctly an earthly vocal. I would have. It's Yoko Ono.
Although she's been making music all her life, it was her conceptual art that first got her noticed, and it still does today. As far back as 1964, performance works like Cut Piece challenged what art could be. Here, a seated Yoko invited members of the audience to cut away her clothing, and when she reworked Cut Piece almost 40 years later, it still had the power to shock.
So Yoko, we're here at the Serpentine, and you've chosen to show 2 of your cut pieces opposite each other. How do you feel when you look at those pieces? Because obviously they're from different times of your life.
But when I see that what I did in the 60s, innocence is what comes to my mind. And, the one that I did in 2003 looks like somebody who went through a shock, a shocking life, which was true.
Well, it's also interesting because it has a different meaning because you have a different meaning.
Well, yes, my life was very different from what I expected. And so that shows. But it was not just that. I was feeling about expressing how women are treated, as well as how we can survive it by allowing people to do things that they want to do, instead of just insisting on what we want to do. So there was many levels of message in that.
That's interesting what you say, because that's slightly against the kind of feminist grain, isn't it? The idea that you can be a strong and experienced woman and do what you want to do while letting other people do what they wish with you.
You have to do both.
Nowadays, conceptual art is quite common. Back then, it was not. It was quite shocking.
Well, I'm shocked. I'm shocked because people are talking about conceptual art as something that's there, and it wasn't.
And how was it received, that work?
Well, I think that people thought they didn't know what to make of it.
That's quite a common reaction to your work, though, don't you think?
Maybe. But I think now it's starting to get focused. It's like all my pieces were in a fog or something, and that fog that's lifted.
It would seem that it's technology that has guided Ono's work out of that fog, and it's made her fanciful concepts from the 60s become real. When her vision, Parts of a Lighthouse, was presented in 1965, it was no more than an idea. But in 2007, technology caught up with her imagination, and it became her most monumental work to date, the Imagine Peace Tower in Iceland. This colossal column of light employs prisms and 15 lasers to shoot light vertically to the heavens.
Power to the people.
Another recently realised artwork was inspired by a line from a self-published brochure in 1967. It was Yoko's fanciful quest to collect every smile in the world. John Lennon's smile was one of the first to be harvested, captured by Yoko in this slow-motion film from 1968 as a portrait that moves.
I first wanted someone to smile. And I thought, well, John is a good one because he represents the world. So let him do it. With John smiling, I thought of that as a portrait on the wall. And you see him just sort of like, you see his face. And one day you just look, and he just smiles. I thought that would be very, very interesting.
Now, new media has caught up with Yoko's conceptual idea, and her quest for smiles has gone global.
Hi, this is Yoko. A Smiles film is what I've always wanted to do, and now we're doing it, and it's great.
And now your smile has developed into a kind of app, and people can upload their own smiles. So eventually you make it to everybody.
The communication media developed so much, so now it can do it in so many ways, and I'm so thankful.
Think peace, act peace, spread peace, and imagine peace. Big kiss, I love you. We are smiling.
Oh, you're looking very young.
Thank you.
Yes,
Yes,
yes.
Do you think
You're
yes?
looking so good. Thank you.
Thank you.
To the Light is at the Serpentine Gallery in London until the 9th of September.
Thoughts on that? Oops, hang on a second. Excuse you. Just get rid of that. Oops.
She wasn't incredibly responsive in that interview. Like
It's very short too, right? Yeah, but it's interesting that, and when I've read interviews with her too, she does the same thing, like in more extensive interviews too, where her answers are relatively short, you know. And there's some ambiguity too, which I think is kind of interesting. What do you think about the Smiles project?
I think it's really interesting, and I see where she's coming from conceptually. Like, it would be really, I guess, informative to have a picture of every human being.
Yeah, but just the reality of that happening is probably not there, but I think it's an interesting goal, and I think the transformation of that project is very interesting too. Oh, did you have your hand? Okay, good. I don't know if you were just adjusting your hair or had a question. Because what it comes out of is an anti-war peace movement, kind of protest idea of one time period, and now it's transformed into something else that's made possible through social media. It's still promoting similar kinds of ideas, but in a different way, I think, which I think is kind of which in a number of ways is really interesting, and it probably has a lot to do with her age as well. I mean, she's less the angry anti-war militant, and more like focusing on people getting along, the world smiling as opposed to kind of going at each other's throats.
I was really surprised to find out how much she's doing in the music industry.
Yeah, she's had a music career for a long time. You're nodding your head. Are you familiar with? Yeah. I mean, she's produced albums and music.
She manages a couple other bands.
Yeah.
Like a female Japanese pop.
Yeah, and that part of things, I don't think I'm all that familiar with. But she's always been kind of more on the the fringes. She's never really been mainstream in that respect. But one of the things that, in terms of, because of her, she's such a known quantity, she can lend her celebrityhood in a sense to projects, which is something that she and Lennon were doing, as we saw last time too. Any other questions? All right, we're gonna. But it's interesting to talk about music because that's a big part of popular culture, and that actually makes a nice segue to talking about pop art. I really we'll kind of introduce this idea today, and then I want to give you an assignment. With pop art, here's just a basic textbook kind of definition of it. So we can think of pop art as both a celebration and a criticism of post-war consumerist culture, and that's one of the things that makes pop art, I think, in some ways interesting, but also a little perplexing at the same time, because certainly not all pop art does this, but a lot of it does, is it seems to revel in pop culture and media, but is also critical of it, so there's this kind of ambiguity sometimes. photographs. It's often playful and rejects abstract expressionists focused on the artist as hero and the spiritual and psychological content of art. So, kind of keep these ideas in mind as we begin to talk about pop art in general. And and I think we'll talk about this, and then we'll shift gears. The term pop art, there's a lot of discussion about where that term originally comes from. There's contention about who used the word first. There were several articles that were written, some that were reviews of this show. The show is at the Whitechapel Art Gallery, which is in England, or in London, and it was called This Is Tomorrow, and this is oftentimes considered the first exhibition that was really showing artists who become known as pop artists. So when this show is open, the term pop art really doesn't exist yet. And there are a number of writers who were using pop art around the same time. Most people, some people, credit Andy Warhol, with first coining it, but that doesn't really seem to be true as well. These are one of the things I think you get a sense of from these photographs here. And this is also the poster that was produced for it. Is that it really was truly an installation of work. It wasn't traditional, hanging art, on the walls. They were spaces that you walked through and experienced. There was a really wide variety of media, some more traditional, others very non-traditional, and a lot of use of imagery from popular culture. For example, this work here, we see a robot from, I think the film is Forbidden Planet or something. Yeah, I'm just that much of a nerd to know that. But then there's this is a painting, so the medium, I guess photograph, but the medium is painting, so that's traditional. But then superimposed on the surface is this image of Marilyn Monroe. So you've got imagery from film culture, in different ways, kind of all blending together. And I think that the poster for the This Is Tomorrow show is interesting because you can read it in various directions. You can flip it around. You've got arrows pointing up and arrows pointing down. Those arrows have always reminded me of the arrows you see on crates, that are like this way up. And you can't really tell which way is up, in this poster. It's kind of it sort of represents a kind of topsy-turvy world. And that, I think, is not a bad